Hello and welcome to Martin's Farm on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm Finlo Costain, the editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Martin Lyons, Chief Exec of the Nature Friendly Farming Network.
Now, you may remember that last month we piloted a new series called Nature Friendly Farmgate. Well, this is the same series, but we changed the name because throughout the year we're going to be learning about what's happening month by month on, well, the clues in the title, on Martin's Farm, Papley Grove Farm in St Neots in Cambridgeshire, as well as meeting key staff and farmers from within the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And today we're going to catch up on what October looks like for Martin. And we're going to ask what seems like a fairly simple question, but I suspect it's more complex. What is farming? We're going to take a look at English policy, but you can see we're also joined by Adam Forrest, the Scotland manager at Nature Friendly Farming Network UK. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Finlo. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Adam's joining us throughout the programme, and then later on we're going to have a dive into Scottish farm policy, look at where it's at, where the priorities are and what the opportunities are for nature-friendly farmers. But we're going to start in England. And Martin, let's start with that question that when we met at the agroforestry show, you said this was something that you thought it was worth discussing, and that's what is farming. Now, so I've done the obvious thing, and I've gone to Google and ChatGPT, and I've just asked the AIs, what is farming? And ChatGPT says it's the practice of growing plants and raising animals to produce food materials and other products that people need. And it's slightly different from Google. It says it's the practice of cultivating the soil, growing crops and raising livestock to provide food materials and other products for human use. And I guess it's that other products, which is the sort of the area that's most interesting.
Yeah, I'd agree. And we've often heard the definition farming is all about food production or underpinned by food production. And I kind of take a wider understanding of it. Actually, if I'm doing cut flowers, bulbs, timber, natural processes, offering other services, does that mean I'm not a farmer if I'm not doing food? And I think we should recognise the role of farming managing a landscape for what society, market, or what I can produce from that. And as we see our climate change, that will need to change. And that's why farming needs to look at the more holistic approach of what can I get best production from my environment, my natural capital, and how do I market that to get a financial business working?
I suppose if I'm sort of thinking back to, when I was General Secretary of a regional National Farmers Union, I think a lot of the farmers that I was talking to there would have felt that there was a scale issue as well, that if you were just farming a couple of acres, you couldn't be called a farmer, you were a smallholder or something. Does scale make a difference?
I don't think it does. If you've got an allotment, a community area, a few acres, and particularly if we look at Scotland in the crofting sector, really small units built around communities, they are producing small amounts, but they're really important. So scale shouldn't be about the piece of it. It's what can you get from the land asset you're producing, and how does that benefit yourself and society going forward?
And I suppose there's another element to it, which is, that a lot of farmers would think that they're sort of vital. Their role is vital for food security. And they'd sort of think of themselves in that way, that if they're growing commodity products of one kind or another, whether that's arable or livestock or dairy, then they're doing the real farming, as opposed to that sort of the cut flowers and the salad leaves and that sort of element that you were talking about. But again, so far as you're concerned, I guess the common denominator is the land. It's about coming back to the land. If you're doing anything with the land, then you're farming to some extent.
Yeah. And for me, we often hear no farmers, no food. Farmers are producing the food on your plate. I'm a bit more realistic. I'm producing the ingredients that the supply chain and others are turning into products. And there's thousands of people beyond my farm gate helping to put that food in your restaurant, on your plate, on your shelf. So we need to be a wider context of who are we as an industry, and actually what are we producing, and recognising the role of that.
Do you think the government recognises the role of that? Because, of course, when we're talking about farming and we're talking about financial support for farming, often, it's for very particular types of activities. It really isn't available for people who are farming smaller areas or even, producing particular things.
I think as a farming industry, we have not done ourselves any good service by only talking about the food production. Food production is managed by the marketplace. It should be paid for and delivered in a fair and equality way. So we get a fair profit, the consumer gets a good product. All of the other goods and services we produce and deliver from our landscape hasn't been talked about. So the government look at the food, well, that's a market, that's a supply chain thing, and not looked at the others. And that's part of the role of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, is to champion all of that in different places, doing different amounts. And that's the sort of some of the hard miles we're having to work at the moment, and getting governments and opposition parties to understand the role of farming now and in the future is all of it joined up and combined. And we need to make sure all policies can deliver that.
I suppose, Adam, the area that we haven't touched on there, we talked about things that are coming out of land, but of course the Nature Friendly Farming Network is all about producing nature as well as those products from the land. How would you think about farming? When you started this job, what did you think farming was, and has your view of farming sort of changed over the year that you've been working in Scotland?
Yes, absolutely. I've come from quite a traditional farming family background, and so I had that idea about what farming was, and being in this line of work, it's really opened my eyes and my mind to all of the things that farmers do for us. And we talk about public goods, and almost everything a farmer does with the land is delivering public goods for us. So that's nature, that's water quality, that's food, that's fiber. Farmers are stewards of our land, and we live on this planet, so they've got huge jobs, absolutely huge jobs, and I have so much respect for farmers for that.
And that natural capital element, I suppose, Martin, is really important going forward, particularly in terms of adaptation. And obviously, we've heard a lot about mitigation, about trying to reduce carbon emissions and get carbon, sort of locked into the soil. But it's the adaptation piece, probably, which is where, the strongest argument really for continued public support comes, that there is this need for farmers to produce the ability to withstand the impacts of climate change.
Very much so. And that adaptation, as our climate changes, food security is having a healthy environment, healthy nature, and healthy soil. If we don't manage those and get public support, where is security or food security and other produce in the future? And also that manage access to nature, mitigating floods. We can do so much more if we think a bit more whole farm approach and value everything that farm produces and celebrates it. Farmers are proud people, and they've been told to believe that it's all about the food production. If we can hold them up and celebrate all of what they produce in different places in the country, we can do so much more, and we can actually hopefully get the policy and the markets giving the right signals to farmers and land managers to produce those goods and services society needs.
Now, I talked about when I was Gensec of an NFU, that was on the Isle of Man. And I mean, this was, 15, 20 years ago. And I suspect that attitudes to what farming is and how land is managed have changed considerably in that time. But in terms of your own experience, Martin, do you think that there's a difference regionally around the UK, both in the terms of the way that farmers see themselves and the way that they define themselves, and in the way that the government sees them in different parts of Britain?
Certainly, I think farmers see themselves. I'm in Cambridgeshire. It's arable, big, larger fields. Crop production. If you're in Cornwall, Cumbria, Scotland, Wales, your production, your system, your environment, your landscape is different. If you're in Cumbria on a hillside, you're not going to do a lot of crop production, but you may have lots of grass and do livestock production or milk production. So it's that balance. And I don't think the government really get the diversity of every farm and every landscape, and why policies and practices need to be flexible to make sure we get the right things and the right signals happening in the right place. And that also goes for the devolved governments, because we're working across a UK. We have a UK food market and a financial market, but the products are different, and we need to understand that. And we can really champion those uniquenesses and add value. But the policy and the government and the supply chain needs to respect that we are from different parts of the landscape.
Adam, I guess in this age of self-identification where, people can self-identify as one thing or another, do you think that there's a difference in Scotland in terms of the way that farmers might identify themselves, whether they might think of themselves more as food producers or whether it's basically the same as England in terms of how they see themselves, whether they see themselves as land managers producing anything from the land or being people that are primarily producing food?
Yeah, I mean, farmers aren't one homogenous group, and we have a huge amount of diversity in our farming landscape in Scotland. So, we've got farmers who are really focused on producing food and very good at doing that, and we've got farmers that are, producing food and restoring nature and doing all of that together. And we've got your land managers who are managing vast swathes of huge estates in Scotland. That's one quite distinct thing that we have these very big land holdings that are being managed for nature or for game hunting, that kind of thing. So yeah, just a lot of diversity in Scotland. I think I couldn't say if there's a huge difference between England and Scotland in that fashion, or the rest of the UK.
Well, I hope that ChatGPT and Google have been listening to this conversation because I think that we've managed to flesh out their definition slightly more. And but let's move on and think about October. We're coming into October now. Autumn is well and truly here. The weather's definitely very different to the way it was 6 weeks ago. What's it like on your farm, Martin? What have you just finished doing? What are you about to do? What does October look like for you?
Well, on our farm, we're on heavy chalky boulder clay, but has been improving the last number of years as we changed in our practices. But we're still waiting for significant rainfall. It's still quite dry. We haven't started drilling yet. While I watch many of my neighbours rushing around with their drills, we're still seeing blackgrass only just starting to germinate, volunteer cereals and weeds. So we're trying to be patient. Forecast looks reasonable for the next few weeks, so there's not a panic on. And also many of our cover crops that we planted back in August, it's been so dry, they haven't actually developed as much as we had hoped and got the real value back. So leaving them another week or two, as we stretch out our drilling window, that means they can actually go and capture some of those nutrients in the ground and do the goods that we want them to do. So over the next few weeks, we will be getting on and starting planting our winter barley, winter wheat and winter beans. All of our land is ready to sort of plant, and then we'll be having sort of that dilemma of, if we've got some weeds there, do we move the soil to terminate the weeds, to kill it as that soil movement, or do we use a treatment of glyphosate? And at the moment we still use some glyphosate for cover crop control and weed control, but there's always this debate and discussion going on of how do we move away from it, what happens if we don't use it. So as a farmer, we're always trying to balance that. And in our environmental areas, we're cutting and removing those pollen and nectar mixes, flower margins around the outside of the fields, cutting some of the hedges where we're beside junctions and roadways, but leaving most of it until later in the season. And we're also starting to put out some winter bird food, supplementary feeding, just in one or two areas, as the wildlife isn't hungry yet, but adding that mixture of seeds being available, just sort of any migratory birds, any birds that got any hunger, there's a bit of seed source for them, and we build that up over the months, over winter.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really interesting sort of overview of what you're doing there. And what I thought would be quite useful, because although lots of farmers listen to this podcast, there are lots of other people who are within the supply chains who aren't farmers and might not know what all of the terms that you use mean. So I want to go through and define some of these, because I think once you start sort of working within farming supply chains, you kind of get to a point where you almost feel that you can't ask, and you should know kind of what these things are. So why don't we start with drilling? What does that mean? You're not using a Black and Decker?
No, it's not my electric drill or battery drill going out there. It's the machine we use to plant the seeds into our soil. So we have a big hopper on it. We have a number of different drills or planters, seed planters. So we can put it at different depths. We have one that has a disc, so it's like a knife that cuts the soil and plants it. And we have one with a tine, so it's like a rigid piece of metal pulling through the soil. And that means we can put different seeds in different places at different depths, depending on what we want to plant.
And how often? I mean, I can remember when I was doing some ploughing years ago on the Isle of Man. That if you hit a stone that was particularly big, then the pin would go in the plough, and you'd have to spend ages sort of getting that sorted again. What you're talking about, having sort of quite stony clay soil, is that a problem for you when you're using that sort of machinery?
Most of the time it isn't because we're running just over the surface. But what we find over the seasons, those big chalky boulder stones push up through the soil profile. So after we've planted the seeds, we use a roller to soften, flatten the soil. And it's up to the job of the person sitting on that tractor seat to get out and pick up any of the stones they see. Because what ends up happening is over winter, that stone rises to the surface. And then when we come next harvest and take the combine harvester through, we'll pick up that stone if we're not careful and put it through the machine, and that's a pretty big expensive bill. So we've got to be careful where those stones end up.
And of course, in the old days, an awful lot of the stones that were being picked out of the fields were going to good use in stone walls. And there would be a lot of stone walls. Certainly, where I come from, you've got quite small fields, lots and lots of stone walls, stone hedges as well. What are you doing with the stones?
Well, a lot of the time, if we can, we bring them home and got a pile. Quite often, we'll make a pile on the side of the field, by the gateway. And if it's near a road, it doesn't take many days for those stones to disappear. Because lots of them, they're pretty, nice round stones. Lots of people want to pick a stone up and take it home for their garden or their rockery. So if we want to lose a few, we just stick them near a roadside somewhere, and someone will soon pick them up and take them for their garden.
And of course, piles of stones just in and of themselves are great for wildlife, aren't they?
And that's what we do stones, branches, trees, it's different habitat in different places. And this is the kind of understanding that as farmers we're starting to learn that mixture of habitat in our landscape is good for such biodiversity.
Tell me about volunteer cereals.
So the volunteer cereals is when we've harvested a crop, some ears, the grains may fall out in front of the combine or come out the back of the combine. And we want them to germinate and grow before we plant the next crop, or else it will contaminate the next crop. So we try and get them to germinate and grow, and that's a volunteer. It's volunteered itself to stay in the field and grown. And we can also use that as a cover crop because that's another plant that's still there. They're keeping the biology and bits going. But one of the challenges we have, sometimes if we're planting, we've got volunteers of a winter wheat or a barley, and we've got another winter wheat or a barley going in that field, we need a clear gap between one and the other. Also, disease or an aphid might hop from our old crop to the new crop. So we've got to sort of make space and break that green bridge, they call it. So the disease may hop from one crop to the next.
And within those crops, do you tend to have a mix of seeds? So it's not just sort of one variety of wheat that you're growing, it's a mixture.
Most of what the varieties we grow now are single species, so it's just one sort of milling wheat, because the supply chain wants it all defined in exactly the same monoculture. But we are trying to grow a mixture of milling wheats together, or a mixture of feed wheats. But we've got to work with our market because we've got to sell the product, and they want to buy it, need to buy it. So we've got to work through the supply chain of what those best mixes can be.
And presumably where you've got diversity within the seed mix, it's more resilient to those aphids and other things that are around that might be interested in one of the varieties, but not others.
Very much so. In any system, if the whole field, if everything's all exactly the same, any disease, any pest goes through the whole lot. If we can break that cycle up, and that's one of the reasons we have a rotation in farming. We grow different things in different fields, and each year there's something different. Because if we do a monoculture just all the same, we're actually putting our farms at risk to pest and disease. That means I've got to either treat it or put up with it. So having that diversity in our system means our production is better and at a lower cost.
The last definition, I suppose, actually, there are another couple, but the first is sort of cover crops and how they differ from cash crops.
So a cash crop is the plants we plant to harvest. And then what we have is catch crops and cover crops. So once we've harvested, for us usually in August, late July, we don't want to leave the soil bare for when we plant that following autumn. So we put a catch crop in. It goes in the ground to capture nutrients and sunshine to put organic matter back into our soil and restructure the soil with the roots. And a cover crop is where we plant the following spring. So we leave a mixture of seeds, really sort of diverse mixture, growing over winter, again capturing sunshine, nutrients, and that crop it may get grazed over winter with some livestock, but it'll get planted the following spring. So we're trying to capture as much sunshine and nutrients right through the growing season, through the year, rather than just a single crop we grow.
So just talk me through that sort of chronology again. Which point are you sticking which in? And the cash crop, that's the only one that you're expecting to make money out of, is it? The others are costing you money.
So we could have a whole episode on this because it is really diverse and complicated. So the cover crops and catch crops, we plant with different seed mixes depending on do we want deep roots, shallow roots? Is there nutrients available? What's the following crop? So we have to take an approach each year to mix that up. Hopefully each year they add value. They restructure the soil, keep the biology alive, they hold nutrients in our soil. So they have a value, but they don't always work. Like this year, we planted them early and it stayed really dry, so they haven't delivered what I want. And that's why sometimes it's good to have government support sometimes to support some of that, because we know it does really good stuff, but it doesn't always work as much as we'd want to.
The last one I wanted to ask you about was winter bird feed, because I'm imagining that you've got a box of trill that you're sort of scattering around a bird feeder, but I imagine it's on a slightly grander scale than that.
Yes, it is. So we plant birdseed plots, so areas that birds harvest, not us, but they don't always develop, and particularly this year they haven't grown as well, but they're available later in the season. As many, public have bird tables in their garden. I have a rather large bird table. It's our landscape. And I go and put seeds out in different places, depending on what species we have or what we're trying to do. And that might be sunflowers, mustards, wheat, barley, beans, all sorts of different seeds. This time of year, they don't need a lot because there's quite a lot in the landscape. But we get further in towards the end of the year and into the new year when there's a hungry gap, we might be putting about 250 kilos a week out across our farm landscape. And that really helps the wildlife and the birds keep going over winter.
And who's paying for that, Martin?
We can get some public support to do that, but a lot of that's our own goodwill. We use a sweep, odd bits left in the bottom of the back of the shed, sweep-ins, tailings, and then we mix it with other stuff. So if I can get public support, I can increase the quality of what I can do, but also recognise it's a good thing to do. So I'll try and support the wildlife and the birds by doing it.
We're going to come back on to that sort of issue a bit later when we talk about countryside stewardship and the ending of or the expiration of those schemes at the moment, because there is the potential impact on a whole number of farms. And we'll come back then, I think, to the flower margins you were talking about, the beetle banks and that sort of thing as well. But the last thing I wanted to ask you before we kind of move on is around those things that you're planting at the moment. So you're talking about winter barley and wheat and beans. Who are your customers for those?
So if for the winter beans,
who's eating that stuff partly as well, whether it's for livestock feed or whether it's for human consumption, that sort of thing.
We try and predominantly grow for human consumption where possible, or yes, human consumption because it's not always food. It may be barley for malting, for alcohol production. So the beans, if we don't have too many pests in next summer, they'll go to North African human consumption market. They eat pulses. If not, it goes into animal feed. The wheats will be milling and biscuit wheats wherever possible. So hopefully that'll go to the local mills and sort of biscuit production things. And barley, our winter barley, we end up usually doing a feed barley because it's a more aggressive plant that will smother the weeds out better. And that plant doesn't do a food quality, but it'll go in the animal sector, feed sector.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, just moving on, you come back from the Liberal Democrat conference. You've been there, I think, this week. What did you take away from that? What were the big issues that were sort of tickling the Lib Dems?
The one thing I've really taken away from, and it's tickling me, is my throat. 4 days of talking to lots and lots of people. So we go to all the major UK political party conferences, Lib Dems, lots of focus on nature, climate, fairness for farmers, the role farmers in delivering for the nation from our landscapes. They had a Nature and Climate Day on the Sunday where we had a stand, and such an opportunity to talk to all of their MPs, and we have a series of meetings, but also their councillors, their supporters and other people. And that spending, for me, 4 days there gives me really good access to talk to a range of people, promoting what the nature-friendly farmers do in the landscape, what policies we need them to champion in opposition, and highlighting some of the risks we've got in going forward if we don't get the policy right.
And do you think that they were receptive? I'm sort of thinking back to the general election, and there was certainly an attempt by the Lib Dems at that point to differentiate themselves from the other parties in terms of their attractiveness to farmers, the way that they sort of suggested that they got it more than other parties did. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think they are trying to position themselves as a champion of farmers. I will reflect over the next few weeks when I go to the other party conferences who's best, but I think they have been that, and they continue to be the champions for nature and climate and a joined up approach and fairness in supply chains, where we're seeing some of the other political parties move away from their climate ambitions and resilience and nature aspects. So it is interesting to see the political parties move into different spaces and trying to champion some uniqueness between them.
Now, of course, after the coalition, they went down to a rump of 10 or a dozen, something like that, I think, MPs in Parliament. Now they're up to 70 odd in Westminster. Was there a sense among the MPs that you were talking to and amongst the party, more broadly, that they were in a much better position to champion the things that we're talking about here?
Yeah, very much. So they've got a bigger movement. I think there's 72 MPs now, Liberal Democrats in Westminster, from different parts of the UK. So that's really good. And they're a bit more of a political force. They have an ability to hold the government to account. And they want to be a constructive opposition. And they're really looking at where do they add amendments to bills or push private members' bills through. So I think, it's good to work with MPs who want to drive for positive outcomes.
I guess it's that sort of positive engagement, which is quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Because behind the scenes, I think parties often are much more positively engaged in terms of those amendments and that sort of thing than they can sometimes appear within the House itself. And I just wonder, Adam, sort of looking up at Scotland for a moment, what's the Lib Dem situation like in Scotland?
I don't think the Lib Dems have a strong presence in Scotland at the moment. So, yeah, there's not. I couldn't give you the number of Lib Dem MSPs, I'm afraid, off the top of my head, but I don't think there is a very strong presence at all.
So do we feel that there is an opportunity? Because I know that when I've been listening to some of the news reporting around the Lib Dem conference, there's been this question about, well, OK, you've got 72 MPs now. Where is it that you're going to pick up new MPs? Because I think there are very few constituencies now. I think there's something like 20 where they've come second, then sort of more down to kind of third and fourth. And so those are the constituencies, of course, that they're most likely to be able to capture in the future. Do you think that there is the opportunity, either Martin or Adam, for the Lib Dems to pick up those issues and pick up sort of more constituencies within the Scottish region?
I would imagine. I can't speak from a knowledge of who's standing in which region at this point in time, but obviously we do have an election in Scotland in May next year. And I think I wouldn't be putting bets on what happens. Let's put it like that. I think that it's likely that there'll have to be some collaboration across political parties in Scotland next year. And I hope the Lib Dems are part of that collaboration.
And of course, just coming out, I think the real opportunities for political parties is set their stall out. How are they going to be supporting farming in devolved nations as well as in the UK context? And that's what we want to hear. And it's up to us as stakeholders, organisations and society to then hold their feet to the fire to say, you promised this before, and we quite often see lots of ambitious words, but where's the action? And I think there is opportunity for all political parties to sort of demonstrate what they could help achieve in the future. And then that's up to us to vote, or citizens to vote for them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it tends to be in just sort of the Highlands and the Islands that the Lib Dems are stronger, where that sort of competition, I suppose, is directly between the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats, both of whom, would say that they speak for farmers and landowners in different ways. Do you get a sense, sort of up in the Highlands and Islands, Martin, of where that differentiation is between the SNP and the Lib Dems?
Now, I'm not quite sure that it's clear for me as someone not in Scotland, the clear definition, but we know we've got Alistair Carmichael up in the islands, who's the chair of the EFA committee in Westminster, and a really strong voice for farming and rural things in Scotland down into Westminster. And the SNP are very much all about Scotland and the role of Scotland in a future political place and their role in Europe in the future. So there is quite a bit of difference between them, but Lib Dems and SNP both see Europe as a key ally and a place they want to work with.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, that conversation north of the border is very different to the European conversation is very different north of the border to south of the border. And as you say, both the Lib Dems and the SNP champions of the idea of working more closely with the EU again, and at some point in the future, presumably wanting to rejoin. Let's move back to English government policy for a moment before we go back to Scotland. And of course, there is a new DEFRA team. We had a conversation, you and I, along with others at the agroforestry show. So I don't want to rehearse this too much, because if people want to kind of hear initial responses, they can skip back to that conversation in their feeds. But Emma Reynolds is the new Secretary of State. She's moved from Treasury, replacing Steve Reed at DEFRA. Steve Reed has gone over to Housing and Communities. Angela Eagle has replaced Daniel Zeichner. Anything, sort of within the last couple of weeks since we last spoke about this that has sort of come to mind around these new appointments, Martin?
Yeah, I think, one opportunity to meet Emma Reynolds, the new Secretary of State, later this week on a farm, so we can get to have a walk and a talk, and that's what I really value, and sort of understand her hopes and ambitions. There is concerns that, Emma has come from the Treasury, and is that about reducing the arm length bodies and cutting DEFRA's budget, because everything's tight fiscally, and the role of nature at delivery. So there is some positive and some negative, and she seems a very keen Secretary of State and wants to have a voice and drive things forward, and hopefully have a loud voice within the cabinet. So, we'll wait to see over the next month. And we've also got the Labour Party conference next week as a point of recording this at the end of September. And we hopefully hear more from her and get a chance to have more engagement with her to sort of understand where she's coming from and what her aims are for the department.
Certainly there, when she was first appointed, there were tweets going out and, various different sort of posts on social media, almost trying to sort of make the case that she was already engaged with farming, that she was interested in farming, that this wasn't something that she'd just been kind of dropped into out of the blue entirely. I think she was on her way to a pig farm on the Saturday that she was appointed. And you talked about the farm visit there. Just where is that farm, and what are the sorts of issues that you're likely to be raising with her? What's the point of the farm visit?
She's bringing various stakeholders, other organisations to be on the farm. Some of the points we would be raising is, what is the roadmap for the industry? What is their ambition for the industry? About scheme being open as soon as possible. Those that are in schemes currently that are closing the end of this year, what is the roadmap for those? Farmers need confidence. We've been told that this is the direction to be, public money for public goods, but that the offer isn't there. So it's about holding that, and then also around trade standards and a number of other areas we can pick up and have a conversation on.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the particular farm that you've chosen to have that walk around, what sort of farm is it? What are the particular things that she's going to be able to see in action?
So it's a choice of DEFRA's. It's I'm an invitee, and it's a tenanted farm to understand, and I haven't had the details come through yet. Okay. And I expect them today, because time is short on this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. So the point of this podcast is to try and take a sort of fairly positive view through some of the doom and gloom that we tend to hear about farming. But of course, one of the big issues right now is the expiration of countryside stewardship agreements. Now, this is bad news, right?
Very bad news. There's well over 5,000 farms finishing stewardship at the end of this year. Some have already finished the higher tier this year, thinking they'll go into the next iteration of SFI. There's over 400 triple SI sites that will no longer have any funding support to deliver better outcomes after the end of this year. So what are farmers meant to do? What are the signals being sent by government? You invest in nature, but then you don't want to continue that delivery. And farmers are in a tricky pitch situation with the poor economic returns currently this year. Do they take some of that land back into other forms of production to try and get some revenue for a year or two until the government makes its mind up what schemes they want to offer?
And I think, we won't at this point sort of re-rehearse that whole thing about the way in which government policy has driven farming to be in the state that it's in at the moment, to a large extent, much as the supply chains and farmers have been involved in those decisions as well. Government policy has been a key driver. And if government policy is changing what is expected from farming around public goods, then it really needs to fund that transition and take responsibility for it. But we've already had those conversations, and probably I'll chat about that with Joe as well on Wheat from the Chaff. So looking at this, in a more sort of positive way, I suppose, the question really is, well, what happens to that land that's currently being managed under countryside stewardship? Joe, when he talks to me, we're chatting actually later this week, and that podcast will go out in a week or so after people are listening to this one. He's going to be talking about, some of the way in which they've already changed their practice. There are things that they're already doing in response to the loss of funding. And so I wonder how you're dealing with it on your farm, because you were talking about flour margins and beetle banks and this sort of thing. It doesn't sound like you're digging these things up. So why not?
Well, our schemes don't finish at the end of this year. We've got another couple of years on some of the agreements. We did come out of a scheme a while ago, and we used some of it as an opportunity to refresh some of the areas. But there's this real interesting balance that some of this habitat, I can see clear wins for our farm businesses, for pollinators, predatory insects and other things. But the cost to deliver it at real high quality value is more than the return I can get. So those awkward corners, grassy edges have a value to my business. But to get the real value for nature recovery, I need to invest in them. And that's where the public value and the public goods come in. And hopefully government supporting me of not just delivering a bit of habitat, but a really enhanced habitat that delivers on that nature restoration targets and air quality, water quality, and all the other stuff government wants us to do. And I get public support and investment to push what I can do on my farm.
So as those schemes do expire, if there isn't anything in place to take them over, what do you do with those, boggy bits or the awkward corners? Are you going to have to plough them out, or do you just leave them so that they kind of retain their existing state, but you're not able to do anything particularly more to enhance them?
I think it all depends on the location of what they are. If it's that awkward corner, that boggy place, putting them back into, say, crop production, particularly in this year with the wheat price and commodity price so low, you aren't going to make much of a return. So you might just abandon them and leave them. But that might mean you might change the practice slightly, and you might be able to graze them or do other things, because you're looking for an economic return for as much as possible from the assets of the landscape. So it will all depend on who they are and what they are. But some of the options that are broad acre across a field, they may get removed. They may get, put a crop of wheat in there, or beans, or something else. So, and it's down to the mindset of the individual farmers and how do they value their landscape and what economic return they can get to run their business.
You talked there about the way in which the resilience which nature offers through those the sort of increase in pollinators, through integrated pest management. I think that's what I'm after, where you've got insects that are beneficial and coming in, sort of eating some of those nuisances on the farm. You were talking about that not being as cost effective. The cost of having that resilience there didn't outweigh the profit. You go into that a bit more.
Yeah, so putting them around the outside of the field where it's less productive, there's a clear balance. Nature can contribute towards what we do. And particularly in our field sizes, we need some nature in the middle of the fields. So if I take out some of the most productive areas in the middle of the field to put a flower strip in there, the cost return is a different picture, because I can get a good crop of wheat in the middle of the field. It's not so good on the outside. So we need to add additional value to it. And that's where I can use the public money and support to make that balance work, but also to make sure we have the right balance of nature across our farm and connectivity that makes nature thrive and underpins food security and resilience within my business. That means I can produce for the future.
So in terms of, just sort of finally on this, what does the Nature Friendly Farming Network want from government in response to this potential cliff edge, this exploration of countryside stewardship for so many farmers? I think 45,000 farmers, something like that, are affected, aren't they?
Yeah, we came out very early, and as soon as we sort of identified the risk, a rollover, offer those farmers a 1 year rollover to keep them in the scheme to deliver funding support to deliver that. If that cannot happen for computer reasons or other reasons, they need to be the first farmers into the new scheme and get them as a pilot ones that offer it now so they can get in. So they may not get the funding straight away from the 1st of January, but they know they're in a scheme, and that first quarterly payment that may come out in April or May. So they've signed a contract. The funds come out of next financial year because government tells us they've spent this year's budget. So there are ways they could help, but they need to communicate to those farmers that they are important. Their habitat they're providing is important, and they are the priorities of government's attention now to support them to carry on delivering.
Sounds like your hunch is that the Treasury isn't going to be rolling over the scheme.
I think it's down to DEFRA. I understand how complicated it is for them because of the computer systems and various other things going on in the background. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't deliver. And that doesn't mean they can find routes round and other options to help those farmers. If that doesn't get a rollover or additional support continued, nature's going to lose. Many farmers will do less next year, and the trust that's been built up between government, society and farmers to deliver that gets eroded even further. And this government has eroded that trust significantly since they come into power. And that doesn't do nature and climate and food security in the future any good at all.
That trust is such an important issue, isn't it? It's so easy to lose trust, and it takes so long very often to rebuild that once you've lost it. And you can undo years of work in the space of almost a single speech, let alone a week or a year's worth of negative policy. And just finally, do you have a sense of the cost, or how much it will cost to do this rollover that you're talking about?
No, because like many of the things within DEFRA, trying to get accurate figures and data out of them is difficult. How many hectares, what range of options are within those schemes? They know what's coming out. I have some idea, but I haven't got the true data. So as a stakeholder, do we compromise our ask to get the priority things sorted out, or is it a broad ask? At the moment, it's a broad ask because DEFRA aren't sharing the details with us to actually identify what is the most important options within those mixes that farmers need to deliver.
Thanks, Martin. And yes, just to clarify the figures that I was using, I was adding an extra zero. It's not 45,000 farms that are going to be affected. It's 4,500, but it's 50,000 hectares that are going to be affected. And just to sort of put that in context, that is twice the size, more than twice the size of Greater London and Manchester and Birmingham added together. So that really is an awful lot of land that's potentially going to be impacted there. Look, I suppose it's a good time to say, when English policies like that, let's all move to Scotland, but let's at least sort of go there briefly. And we're joined by Adam Forrest from Nature Friendly Farming Network in Scotland. He's the Scotland manager there. So why don't we start with how the network works in Scotland, Adam, and what sort of relationship you feel that you have with the Scottish government?
Sure, thanks, Finlo. Yeah, in Scotland, we work in a very similar way to the rest of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. So we bring together farmers and crofters who believe that nature is central to food production and climate action and rural resilience. We have a Scottish steering group, which is made up of farmers and crofters. And we have a small team in Scotland. So we've got a country manager and a sustainable farming officer. And so we split the work into policy and delivering on-farm events. And we're supported by that wider UK team. It's great because we have an exchange between the different country teams, so we get to learn a bit about what's happening and share learnings between countries. And sometimes there's probably more collaboration happening between countries teams at NFFN than there is between governments, as I understand. But yeah, we have a distinct Scottish programme because obviously agriculture is devolved. So we position ourselves in Scotland as a constructive and critical friend to government, and that means we provide evidence. We put farmers in front of policymakers and officials. And it's all about providing practical examples of the kinds of things that we talk about. Our steering group chair, Denise Walton, who's a farmer based in the Scottish Borders, she sits on the Scottish Government's Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board, or ARIOB, and they review a lot of the agricultural reform, policy reform that's happening here. Denise also sits on the Scottish Biodiversity Forum and Nature Scot roundtables. So we've got good influence in Scotland, and we've got some good relationships with the government, I would say.
You talked about one or two of the groups or boards that Denise is sitting on there, and of course the departments of government are different in Scotland in terms of their names and what they do to the names that we're kind of used to kind of trip off the tongue, like DEFRA and housing and communities and stuff within England down at Westminster. So what are the kind of key government departments that you're sort of pointing towards?
Yeah, so we engage most of all with the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands portfolio, and that is headed up by Cabinet Secretary Mary Goujon, and you've got Jim Fairley, who's the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity that works within that department. So we engage most with them, and within that portfolio you have you have food and food industries also in there. Biodiversity and environment and climate change kind of sits separately. So we do engage a little bit with those portfolios as well. We've also got a thing called Good Food Nation Act in Scotland, and so we've engaged recently within the Rural Affairs Committee on some scrutiny of the Good Food Nation National Plan, which was published earlier this year.
And just picking up on one or two of those things that you talked about, in terms of the Good Food Nation Act, that is now an act, is it? That is part of sort of legislation that's in place.
That's right. Yeah. So we had the national plan, which was published earlier this year. So what the Act does, so the Act has been coming down the line for the past decade at least, and what the Act does is it's trying to create a shift in food culture and how we frame and value food. And think about food through a government and through a policy lens. So there's a number of outcomes within the Good Food Nation, first Good Food Nation plan, and lots of policy will need to be considered through those outcomes and some indicators that come from them. The really interesting part of it is the national plan will inform local plans and regional plans, local authorities, health boards. They will have to come up with their own Good Food Nation plans, and we think there's some really interesting opportunities over the next couple of years as those regional plans come into play.
Just like that conversation about what farming is, I imagine that lots of different people will have notions of what they think good food is. How is it sort of considered within the legislation?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the headline of the Good Food Nation Act is that the Scottish Government wants everyone in Scotland who cooks food, eats food, produces food, to have pride and pleasure in that. So it is, as I say, it's about culture change, and it's about using food and thinking about food differently, so that it can support public health outcomes, so that it can support different ways of managing our land and producing food. But yeah, it's really based around, I guess I would say, food culture and public health.
So it's sort of taking Burns Night and Hogmanay and trying to sort of, extend that goodwill towards food and drink sort of throughout the year. And just there was another sort of phrase, a word that you used, which was connectivity in relation to ministerial responsibilities. When you say connectivity from an English perspective, I think that probably would mean rural broadband, that sort of thing. In Scotland, is it that, or is it sort of connection between the islands and the mainland in Scotland?
As I understand it, it is broadband, but it's also some other transport and some other kind of connections in these kind of rural areas. Yeah,
sort of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, Adam, you've got a Scotland summit coming up for the Nature Friendly Farming Network. You've told me this is definitely not a conference; it's a summit. What's the difference, and what's happening?
Yeah, so a summit happens when there's a serious issue to be discussed, and right now, as I mentioned, Scotland's in the middle of its agricultural reform programme. So the summit is a platform for some really important discussions around that, and in the run up to next year's Scottish election. So it's happening on the 7th of October at Dynamic Earth. We've got around 200 policymakers. NGOs, farmers, lots of farmers, and a good contingent of young people coming along. So we're really looking forward to that. And we're going to have some big discussions around the agricultural budget, around collaboration and scaling collaboration in Scottish agriculture, supply chain innovation, and all of that is going to be centered around farmers and farmer case studies on the day. So it's about generating momentum for that bold political leadership that we really want to see, and it's about growing nature-friendly farming in Scotland at this pivotal time.
It's really interesting the way that both you and Martin have sort of come back to the idea of the case study, the farm visit. These are the important things. Let's frame things around what farmers are actually doing, the good things that they're doing, and then the things that they need to sort of expand those opportunities. And certainly, just on social media this morning, I saw one or two films that were going out sort of promoting the summit, where I think it was Ruth Ashton Shaw and Cora Cooper, who Cora's of course been on the podcast before, and it was really nice just to sort of see their farms in context. So it's nice to see those little films on social media. Martin, what are your ambitions for NFFN in Scotland and for the issues around this sort of replacement to CAP?
I think for me, it's growing, ever growing our voice in Scotland, making other people aware of which committees and departments and stakeholder tables we sit round. We're recognised as a moving and loud voice, progressive voice within Scotland of to get to be engaged with. So having a summit where we can put all that together and demonstrate what our farmer members are doing and the opportunities to do more of with the right support as we look into next year and a Scottish election. How do we make sure all parties that are standing for MSP for Parliament there to actually get the right outcomes? Farmers and crofters in Scotland have the solutions available to them to deliver for nature, for climate, for food, for rural resilience. But we've got to get the framing right, and that's the point of the summit: is to elevate our voice there to demonstrate what we can do as farmers and crofters.
It's interesting when you're sort of talking about those issues there and those opportunities, because of course organisations like the NFU are very much trade bodies. They're representing the interests of farmers, and they're arguing, very often for farmers to retain things that they need. And then you kind of look at an NGO, like Nourish Scotland, I suppose, or the RSPB, and they're arguing for the things that their members, think are most important. What is the Nature Friendly Farming Network? Is it a trade body or an NGO, or where does that balance lie?
So it's a farmer membership organisation with public supporters and organisations. We sit in the middle. We represent farmers and champion farmers, the actual members doing stuff. The NGOs on that side are asking farmers to do stuff, and they're campaigning for farmers to be able to do stuff. We're in the middle there saying we can do this, but we also recognise some of the stuff isn't great as farmers, and not all farmers are able to or willing to deliver those outcomes for the future and for now. So we have a more progressive mindset, I think, and sort of hopefully solutions focused, championing what is happening and what we can do. But we want to take all farmers, public and organisations along with us. So it's about bringing as many as we can together. And that's why it's a network. It's not a single voiced body thing, because we're so diverse as farmers and crofters across Scotland and across the UK. But we know where we need to get to have a resilient business, a resilient landscape, and really good food, fibre, timber, whiskey, and everything else produced from our landscape.
And Adam, just coming back to you, the last sort of area that I really want to go into today is legislation in Scotland, looking at where we are in terms of the replacement for the common agricultural policy that we've already mentioned, because obviously Scotland is a couple of years behind where where Westminster is, where DEFRA is. So what's going on there? Where are we in terms of the legislation? What stage are we at? And what are NFFN pushing for?
Yeah, so we're still running with what's essentially, the legacy EU CAP scheme. So we've got basic payments, greening, less favoured area schemes. We've got coupled beef and sheep support, but these are being phased out at the moment. And the piece of legislation that's bringing in this new support framework is called the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act, which came in last year. So that's the framework for the new support structure in Scotland. And by 2027, we're going to have this new four-tiered support framework. And tier one is that sort of area-based payment that will now be tied to producing a whole farm plan. So there'll be some conditions on that. Then we've got tier two, which is essentially enhanced greening. So some higher payments for nature and climate actions. And then tiers 3 and 4. Tier 3 is essentially your agri-environment scheme, some supply chain support, and tier 4 is about that, skills, advice, and innovation. Now, the Scottish agricultural budget sits around 650, 700 million per year. And just to sort of give you some context, we know from a report called the Scale of Need report that we think there should be about 1.8 billion coming into the agriculture budget to deliver what's needed for climate and nature. Obviously, it's very, very difficult time to ask for that amount of money, but yeah, so we sit around 700 million in that in that budget. Now, the Scottish Government have so far committed to 70% of that total agriculture budget going to tiers 1 and 2. And so that leaves, a small, much 30% to go across tiers 3 and 4. Tier 3 is where all of that heavy lifting is going to have to take place when it comes to nature and climate. And that, it's not going to be enough to do what we know we need to do. And so, what we're asking for is actually some redistribution. We want to see more investment in, if we're going to continue with what's essentially, the current agri-environment and climate scheme, we want to see more investment in that. And in order to deliver that increased investment, actually, we do have to look at redistribution. The area-based payments that we'll see going into tier 1. We're talking about capping those payments so that we can redirect some funding into tier 3. We absolutely recognise that farmers are facing big economic challenges right now in Scotland. Scotland has a lot of marginal land. There's a lot of farms that will struggle without support, without to produce these public goods that are food, nature outcomes, and climate outcomes. So we're not asking for that support, the rug to be pulled. We're not asking for a cliff edge. What we're asking for is appropriate funding for farmers to deliver on those public goods of nature, climate, and food. And we really need that bold leadership and a long-term vision. And that you've spoken about it quite a lot today already. To give farmers confidence in terms of what's coming down the line. We're the Nature Friendly Farming Network. We're all about farmers learning from each other. So we also want to see more investment coming into knowledge exchange and peer-to-peer learning, because we see the power of that every day with the events that we organise.
Yeah, fantastic. It's fascinating to sort of hear, the way things are working in Scotland, because it sort of it echoes much more closely the way that the Common Agricultural Policy worked, with those area payments still there, and certainly. In the last few years, Patrick Holden from the Sustainable Food Trust and myself, we've both argued quite strongly for a continuation of area payments, sort of in the face of, I think, lots of NGO opposition, sort of much more focused around public payments for public goods. And my feeling is that the Scottish balance seems to be pretty good, where you've got those area payments, as you say, if you can cap them, all well and good, but they're sort of linked to whole farm plans, so that there is a need, there is a recognition that every acre can be improved. Its relationship with nature can be improved, and there seems to be a recognition of that within that area-based approach. And then, as you say, the enhanced greening beyond that. What's your feeling at the moment, Martin?
Yeah, I think that we look at how the across the devolved nations, how the evolution of the CAP has changed. In England, have they really set out what they want to achieve with it? How does it support the whole of the rural businesses, farming, everything? In Scotland, having that level of defining what they want for a set amount of money, focusing on a whole farm approach, can set them up for a journey for the future of actually focusing on getting the right outcomes in the right landscapes and communities to go forward. So I think it'd be interesting to see how it evolves. There's obviously been a lot of lobbying to keep as much budget down to simplicity and getting money out the door. But we've got to have ambition. We've got to meet the challenges and changes that are already coming in our landscapes and our businesses due to climate and markets. So we've got to help the Scottish Government to think about the role of that journey and transition over the years ahead.
And one of those sort of keys, I suppose, is the outcomes and how those outcomes are assessed, making sure that the area payments, and even the enhanced screening aren't just going out of the door based on inputs, and they may or may not get delivered. And that whole farm plan seems to me to be a really critical element of it, Adam. And I just wonder if you could talk me through, one or two of the key elements. What is expected within that whole farm plan in terms of farm planning, in terms of outcomes that are expected?
Yeah, so at the moment, when I say a whole farm plan, it's not one plan. It's actually, several pieces of work that farmers are being asked to do. So there's a biodiversity audit. There's an app being developed to support farmers to do that. There is, an IPM, integrated pest management plan. There's an animal health and welfare plan. There's a carbon audit. And there's one more which I've forgotten at this point in time. But these five plans they're being asked to do, and at the moment there's not, they're being asked to do them. There's not a whole lot else they're being asked to do on top of that. So I think it's the start of a journey. I think that the conditions will develop over the coming years, because the first part is actually just making sure that farmers are comfortable doing this. Many of them will be doing it already, but I think that there will be more conditions that are brought in as the years go by.
But Martin, wouldn't that be amazing if we had that across the UK? The idea that there is a genuine biodiversity audit happening on every farm, that there is a carbon audit happening on every farm, as well as sort of looking at the integrated pest management approach and the farm animal health and welfare audits as well. I mean, these things are really important, and just actually having a sense, having a plan, having an audit, having a sense of what the situation is, the baseline on your farm, is a really important starting point.
Absolutely, and it's something within the England context we championed in the early development of elm that got thrown out. And in Northern Ireland, we see them focus on soil. Soil and our landscape, nature is the key asset for our nation. And actually having standardized data to actually help farmers improve that. But also, if we look at to private markets as that comes in, if we can have a nation's audit of what we've got, and then also work out what does the public need to contribute towards, and then if there is private finance and funding available to do additionality and other things, or things that benefit other companies, that delivers transparency and real value. And what we see is different things happening in different places. So how do we drive a shared approach? Farming in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, in England is farming, but in just geographic different weather things. But that peer-to-peer learning and finding the best practices and speeding up that journey for farmers to avoid mistakes will be critical, but it's got to be based on some standard data. What are we measuring? What do we want from, to get outcomes to be delivered from?
Yeah. And in terms of public goods, just making sure that farmers are paid for that audit information, that they're paid to, to make sure that that baseline approach is what better use of money, at this point than trying to get a national baseline, as you say. And then just sort of coming back to that innovation bit. Now, I know we're running over, but Adam, if you could just sort of talk me through finally around where you think the biggest opportunities are for NFFN, for nature-friendly farmers more generally to deliver in Scotland. And I guess part of that is around that innovation funding and sharing of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just build on the previous point about whole farm plans, having the data is one thing, and that's a fantastic start. But what you do with that data, that's the really important piece, and making sure that there is funding within the system to support farmers to undertake measures which will support, things to improve from that baseline. That's where we need to go. That's a really key role that I think the Nature Friendly Farming Network can continue to play, supporting farmers on that journey to, improving and moving from that baseline. There's working with farmers, there's working with actually advisors on that, and connecting them in with the fantastic farmers that we have throughout the network. But in terms of innovation and where we see things going next, we want to see absolutely more knowledge exchange, more funding for this kind of peer-to-peer learning model. And we want to see more support in Scotland for farmers to be able to work together in clusters and in co-ops, and at landscape and kind of catchment scales going forward. So we want to see public money for public goods in terms of these things, and we believe that can really drive scale and value for public money when we get farmers to support farmers to work together like that. And I will also say, we've had some funding through a programme called FERNS, which is the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland. So this is a Nature Scotland Scottish Government fund, and it's been supporting pilot projects to look at kind of natural capital approaches in Scotland, which can support private finance coming in and working in a blended way with public money. So we've got a couple of interesting projects that I would mention. We've got our first Lens project in Scotland. That's the Landscape Enterprise Network in Fife, and that's sort of bringing in payments from the supply chain to farmers and making sure that they're supported to deliver the ecosystem services that producing primary goods is so dependent on. And we've also got an interesting project called the Drill Burn Natural Capital Producers Cooperative, which is also in Fife, and that's looking at a catchment scale approach to river restoration and carbon payments. But using a cooperative model, and at the moment that's quite an innovative way of farmers working together to do that. So talked a wee bit there about natural capital markets. I also say that we're also seeing these natural capital approaches, and as private finance comes into these different projects, it can inflate land values and it can keep new entrants out of farming. And I think it's really important to say that we want farming to be accessible to young people and to new people coming in, and so we just need to be careful that when we look at these new natural capital approaches, that we're not entrenching this extractive approach to land that regenerative agriculture and this movement is trying to actually move away from.
Fantastic. Adam, thanks so much for taking us through that. And it's worth just sort of mentioning that we are planning to have a bit of a focus on Scotland over the course of the coming months. And so there will be more podcasts that are looking specifically at some of the things that you were talking about there, and at some of the work the Nature Friendly Farming Network and the other networks and other farmers are involved in as well in Scotland. So Adam Forrest from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, thanks so much for joining us. Martin Lines, of course, as ever, Martin's Farm. We couldn't do it without you. It's been great to have you. That's all we've got time for. We'll be back next month thinking about November in St Neots and continuing our tour of the Nature Friendly Farming Network around the UK. If you haven't listened yet, then we broadcast several shorter impromptu conversations from the recent agroforestry show, so it is worth scanning back in your feed for those. And if you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, comment, review us, and share our links. It all really helps to build the Farmgate listening family. Farmgate, of course, is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. So it's cheerio from Martin and Adam.
And goodbye, and see you next time.
Goodbye from me. Thank you.
And I've been Finlow Costain. Bye for now.